Hello, I am Magdalena Kaiser, Director of Public Relations for VQA Wines of Ontario, also providing knowledge and resources on behalf of the Ontario wine industry. So welcome to VQA Cabernet Franc 2.0. This is part of a 10-part series of webinars featuring Ontario star varieties. And hopefully by now, you've probably watched all of the other sessions on Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, and Gamay Noir. Each of these sessions are specifically designed to focus on one of Ontario's key varieties and talk about the key flavors, the different styles, and special food pairings. On top of that, we have a great opportunity to meet the makers. And to do so, we have with us again, John Sabo, if we can go to the next slide. Welcoming back John Sabo, Master Sommelier, to lead us through this series and interview with Louise Engel, Gabriel DeMarco, Ed Haddon, Craig McDonald, Bruce Nicholson, and Paul Pender. So thank you for tuning in. And John, looking forward to a great session on Cabernet Franc.
Thank you, Magdalena, and thanks for coming back, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the series so far. I've certainly learned a lot chatting with these winemakers, hearing about their stories and learning about the specifics of their terroir, their little corner of Ontario wine country. And today, we're talking about a variety that I am particularly fond of. I know I've said that with the previous 4 varieties, and I promise you I'm fond of those as well. Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Gamay are clearly very suitable in our neck of the woods, and Cabernet Franc, no doubt about that variety. I would think we're going to hear from the winemakers in just a moment how they feel the variety is, but just as a little reminder, we're in the thick of harvest. It is late September. The winemakers are tired. You'll notice perhaps an extra gray hair or two for those who haven't brought their Pinot Noir in just yet. Whereas with Cabernet Franc, you can sit back, relax, and sweat a little bit less because I think, as we'll hear from most of the winemakers, it's, I wouldn't call it an easier variety, but it's one that's perhaps a little less stressful. We all love Pinot Noir, but we know it can be a little bit more tricky in the vineyard, and certainly we're delighted to have varieties like Riesling that are so hardy and perform so well, and Chardonnay, and even Gamay Noir. Cabernet Franc, I would certainly plant if I were going to start a vineyard in some part of Ontario, because I think it performs extremely well here. It's not that you can plant it everywhere. We're going to learn about the specific little corners where the variety performs at its best. And in just a moment, we're going to bring in all of these winemakers. But again, let me just take you through a brief little introduction to Ontario wine country. Hopefully you've seen some of the previous versions of these presentations where I give a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more detail about the what, when, why, and how of Ontario. But again, just as a little reminder, it is all about lakes, latitude, and limestone. And here the latitude, you can see that, well, what does latitude mean? It really determines the length of sunshine hours, the number of sunshine hours, and the growing season to some degree. But really, as we've been discussing throughout this entire series, it's mostly a question of the lakes here, right? With our rather intense, severe continental climate, if it weren't for the Great Lakes system, and in particular Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, we wouldn't be growing grapes here, certainly not as successfully, and certainly not with the vinifera varieties that do perform so well, because we have this big body of water next to all of the vineyards in the province, which makes grape growing possible, kind of mitigates those really cold moments of the winter, and allows continuous airflow throughout the growing season to reduce the risks of molds and mildews and other vine diseases. And then the third part of our story here is all about limestone. If you've picked up a textbook on wine growing around the world, you'll have certainly heard of limestone. It underpins many of the world's great vineyards, and Ontario, Southern Ontario, is no different. There's a beautiful photo of Balls Falls. You can see the sedimentary nature of limestone. And as I've said all along, really less about the chemistry, although chemistry is important, of course, but more about the structure that it gives to the soils, having chunks of limestone, or in some cases ground up powdery limestone, allows for better structure for growing grapes, which is to say a little bit more drainage, yet with enough water retention that irrigation is not necessary for the most part in southern Ontario. I've mentioned before how the glaciers impacted the lay of the land here. And yes, the retreating ice over a period of about 10,000 years or so did churn up, grind down, and leave us with what we see today. Major topographic features like the Niagara Escarpment that are critical for wine growing. And of course, they did churn up that limestone, grind it down, and pepper the soils with this magic white dust, if you will, that vines seem to love, not just in Ontario, but in so many other parts of the world. All right, and again, just a quick reminder, never forget to mention to your customers, those walking to the shop, that VQA means 100% Ontario grown, not to be confused with the wines that are bottled in the province from both domestic and imported juice. VQA is all about local, and we know the local story has become so important over the last few years. I guess over the last few months, even more important as people turn to their own backyards to get not only what they eat, but now increasingly what they drink as well. And VQA functions like an appellation system, much like any appellation system anywhere in the world, based on the European model, whereby all the terms are controlled. So if you see Ontario, if you see one of the appellations or sub-appellations, it has been controlled and verified by the VQA. They determine the varieties that can be planted, and then also things like minimum ripeness at harvest and so on. At the basic level, we're looking at VQA Ontario. So that's for a wine grown anywhere in one of the wine growing regions, either an official appellation or an emerging region, can fall under VQA Ontario. So for example, a blend between Niagara and Prince Edward County would fall under VQA Ontario. A step above that is the more restricted appellation areas, and you know the three already by now: Lake Erie North Shore, Niagara Peninsula, and Prince Edward County, the three official appellations. And in the Niagara Peninsula in particular, and also down in Lake Erie North Shore, there is a sub-appellation, the South Islands, but the sub-appellation system of greatest importance is certainly in the Niagara Peninsula, the most historic area that has now, over the past 50 or so years, been subdivided into areas of discrete and notable and measurable differences. So now that we can start with certain varieties grown across the Niagara Peninsula, look at some of these sub-appellation differences, which is really quite exciting for wine lovers. And at the top of the pyramid, if you will, single vineyards that have over time distinguished themselves to the point where a winery has decided it's worth putting the name of that vineyard on the label because it has its own unique features, its own unique characteristics. So again, briefly, here are the appellations: Lake Erie North Shore down in the southern corner of the province, Niagara Peninsula by the falls, and over to the east of Toronto around Belleville, Trenton area is Prince Edward County. Emerging regions, we've tasted a few in this series. I think we'll be seeing a lot more from areas over on Lake Huron, up in the Ottawa Valley, in the Collingwood area, north of Toronto. These are areas that are not official growing regions yet, but could well one day be counted among the official appellations. A story to be followed. And as I mentioned, the Niagara Peninsula divided into its 10 sub-appellations, and I would say two kind of in-between sub-appellation and appellation areas. That would be the area along the escarpment, this the so-called bench appellation areas: Beamsville Bench, 20 Mile Bench, Short Hills Bench. This would be one sort of general area. And then over here by Niagara on the Lake, this area, you could consider that another separate subtype appellation. And the differences here, as I've been discussing all along, as we'll hear from the winemakers, in fact, here it will be particularly important to talk about the location, specific location of vineyards for Cabernet Franc, whereas Riesling, Chardonnay, Gamay, and Pinot Noir are more short cycle varieties, pretty reliable, regular ripeners, no matter where you plant them, so that you will find them everywhere from the Niagara Lakeshore up into Vinemount Ridge. Cabernet Franc, being a later ripening variety, really needs to find a little sweet spot, the slightly warmer part of the peninsula. So you won't see too much of it up in Vinemount Ridge. It's too far from the lake, doesn't have enough of that moderating effect. And it's simply a challenge to ripen it regularly, which is why you'll find it in some of the warmer areas, certainly down in Niagara on the lake area. St. David's Bench being about 10 kilometers from the lake, probably one of the warmest sub-appellations if you look at the numbers. But as we'll also hear from winemakers, Cabernet Franc performs particularly well down in this Lincoln Lakeshore area, Creek Shores areas closer to Lake Ontario, where you've got a longer suave growing season, really heavily moderated by Lake Ontario. These are some details that you can dive into at a later date. Just gives you some of the background on each of those sub-appellations. And I mentioned the Niagara Escarpment as one sort of area within the Niagara Peninsula with slightly cooler conditions than a little bit further along in the Niagara on the lake area. If you check those growing degree days, you'll notice it's a little bit warmer down here. Growing season is a little bit longer, 207 frost-free days above -2. And that, although, again, it doesn't sound like much of a difference, makes all the difference for a grapevine, a very sensitive instrument to measure climate, if you will. And, you know, down here, for example, you'll find Cabernet Franc, you'll find Cabernet Sauvignon, you'll find Merlot, you'll find even Syrah, later ripening varieties that need a little bit more warmth, whereas those varieties are certainly rarer in the cooler parts of the Niagara Peninsula. And then over in Prince Edward County, there is some Cabernet Franc grown, not a lot. This is mostly, at least in my opinion, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir country, a little bit of Riesling. As I said, you do find Cabernet Franc, but it tends to be very much on the edge of its possible growing area. So you get a very light, leafy, very fragrant, very beautiful style, but quite a bit less dense and structured than those that you'd find over in the Niagara Peninsula area. And then down in Lake Erie North Shore, no problem ripening the variety down here. We've got lots of sunshine hours, we've got lots of warmth, we've got a pretty long growing season. So no challenge in making really ripe and quite lovely Cabernet Franc. Here the soil structure is a little bit different, a little bit sandier, which tends to, in my experience at least, produce wines of a little bit less tannic weight, a little less tannic density and structure, but what you lose on that side, you gain on perfume and finesse. So if I were looking for a really finessed Cabernet Franc, I would go down to Lake Erie North Shore or even over into Prince Edward County or maybe some of the cooler areas of the Niagara Peninsula. Some specifics about Cabernet Franc. As a variety, it is the most planted red grape variety in Ontario, actually neck and neck with Merlot. There's more Cab Franc than there is certainly of Gamay or Pinot Noir. Why is that? Well, it is a reliable variety. I think we'll hear that winemakers like it a lot because you can count on it year in, year out. It survives winters really well, better than Merlot. In fact, it ripens a little bit earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon. So again, more regular production. And a lot of those wines that you see labeled as Cab Merlot are indeed mostly, in many cases, Cabernet Franc, not Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Franc plus Merlot, maybe a little bit Cabernet Sauvignon thrown in there. It represents 11% of the total VQA wine production, but a lot of that is in blends. As we'll see, even some of the wines labeled as Cabernet Franc have a little splash of Merlot or a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon or some other varieties. We'll hear why that is from the winemakers in just a moment. And the last thing I'd point out that it's used for ice wine as well. As unlikely as that might seem to someone from the outside, I feel that Cabernet Franc makes some absolutely tremendous ice wines, really, really lovely, really beautiful strawberry jam type perfumes. It's quite unique. You know, this is certainly a Canadian specialty. I have not seen red ice wine from any other part of the world, and certainly not Cabernet Franc ice wine. So there you have it, something that's completely and totally uniquely Canadian. When we're talking basic styles of Cabernet Franc, we're talking, of course, about dry table wines, anywhere from the light, fragrant, more herbaceous tinged wines, and we shouldn't be afraid of the green. It is part of the DNA. It is part of the varietal makeup of Cabernet Franc. Those pyrazines that give the wonderful, and I'm going to say wonderful, peppery green pepper notes that I think are part of the cool climate expression. If you don't like that, well then go to Napa or go to Argentina, go somewhere else. For me, Cabernet Franc has to have a little bit of that, sometimes more roasted herbal flavor, sometimes more fresh green herbal flavor. It's part of the wine, and we should embrace that. We should love it. I certainly love it. From lighter styles all the way through to pretty powerful, ripe, wood-aged, oak-aged wines. You will find ice wine I've already mentioned. Rosé, of course. Cabernet Franc makes some pretty delicious, fresh, lively, again, herbaceous styles of rosé. If you want a little bit more herbal punch, go with Cabernet Franc Rosé. If you don't like that so much, well, then you're going to go towards perhaps a Gamay or a Pinot Noir based rosé. And lastly, I'll point out there is a little bit of sparkling wine, even traditional method sparkling wine made from Cabernet Franc that's surprisingly delightful. Food pairings. We've been talking about this with all of the other varieties. We know that cool climates in general, and Ontario in particular, makes for very food-friendly wines, and that's really just another way of saying high acid wines. And acidity is key. Talk to any chef, the acid balance in a dish is the most critical thing. That's why many chefs cook with wine. It's not for the flavors of wine that mostly get cooked out. It's for the addition of acidity in many cases, plus a little bit of winey flavor. So wines with high acid, like those from Ontario, tend to pair well with a pretty broad range of foods. Cabernet Franc fits right into that mold. Talking about that herbal, vegetal side, you can pick that up beautifully in, for example, dishes involving roasted vegetables, like you see in the image there. Cabernet Franc Rosé, what wouldn't that match with? Of course, it goes beautifully with all things from picnic right through to mid-January fare. I like the idea of those chicken kebabs that you see there with some pepper, some yellow pepper in this case, yellow and red pepper, playing off on the peppery side of the variety. And then ice wine, you can play around with a lot of different things here. Again, I would, here you've got creme brulee as a suggestion. I love Cabernet Franc ice wine with chocolate-based dishes. It's sort of that almost Bavarian type of pie idea where you've got cherries and chocolate together, because Cabernet Franc ice wine is all about the raspberry coulis. It's all about the strawberries and cherries with a kind of bittersweet, not too sweet chocolatey dish. I wouldn't go milk chocolate. I would go more dark chocolate with my Cabernet Franc ice wine. So there you have it, lots of options. Cheeses we've been mentioning all the way along with our different varieties. Here with Cabernet Franc, particularly the more structured ones, I would head towards more aged cheese, drier cheeses like you see here. So I'm talking cheddar, I'm talking things like the Thornlow Temiskaming. You can see it's a nice crumbly, hard textured cheese where you've got acid tang from the milk itself, plus the pinch of salt. That salt is going to both soften the tannins in one of your more structured Cabernet Francs and bring out the fruit, like a little pinch of salt on your cantaloupe would bring out the fruit in that. When you're moving on to the sweeter versions of Cab Franc from frozen harvest, well, then you're into the blue cheese category. Things like that Back 40 Highland Blue and a little bit of Cabernet Franc ice wine. A magical little match. One of the sparkling wines, head back over to something even tangier like a goat's cheese. There's the Stonetown Capri Ella is a nice option there. All right, so it's time to bring in our star performers for the day, the makers of these wonderful wines. These are the wines that you have selected for us and that I have here in my glass. So let us now bring in Louise Engel from Featherstone Estate, who's going to tell us about her philosophy of Cabernet Franc. Louise, do we have you?
Yes, thanks very much, John. Boy, if I wasn't already a fan of Cabernet Franc, I certainly would be now after that wonderful introduction and all that background knowledge. That was fabulous. So thank you for including Featherstone in today's discussion, and also a big shout out to the PCs and the Vintages team who do a really great job selling this wine for us. Just a quick overview of Featherstone. We're a 23-acre estate winery up on the 20 Mile Bench, just outside Vineland. And in 1999, my husband, Dave Johnson, who is actually the winemaker, and I purchased the property. It was fully planted, including the Cabernet Franc, which went in the ground in the 1980s. We also have some of the oldest Riesling vines in the peninsula, which were planted in 76, but obviously Riesling is a story for another day. So we're a small family-run operation. We have a staff of about 5 people, and we've distinguished ourselves with our eco-friendly practices. So just a quick minute to address a few of those. Although we're not certified organic, we are pesticide-free and we are insecticide-free. And our farmhouse is sort of smack dab in the middle of the vineyard. So we feel a certain responsibility to farm in a way that's chemically reduced and as sustainable as possible. So this includes bringing in a small flock of sheep every summer that do the leaf removal in the Cabernet Franc. In order to grow quality grapes, we want to remove the grape leaves that shade grape clusters. Grapes that are exposed directly to the sun are cleaner. The morning dew dries off them more quickly, so they're less prone to molds and mildews. The grapes are riper and have more varietal typicity. So leaf removal is a fairly common practice. What's less common is using sheep to do it. And we were the first vineyard in Canada to do this. It's more common in New Zealand, where they have a lot of sheep. And Dave was working a harvest there in 2007, saw this done, and brought the idea back with him to Canada. So our Black Sheep Riesling, which is also a vintage's essential, is named after the sheep that helped to make it. Now, the other eco-friendly practice that is uniquely Featherstone is the use of a bird of prey to scare away the nuisance birds that want to eat the Cabernet Franc. I'm a licensed falconer, and I fly a hawk in the vineyard to deter the starlings and robins that want to eat the Cabernet Franc grapes. The hawk doesn't even really need to catch any of these nuisance birds. He's just a great deterrent. They recognize his silhouette, and it gets really quiet in the vineyard, and they just leave. They go across the road and the neighbor's grapes, I guess. So many of the product consultants watching this will have met Amadeus, my hawk, and I just wanted to let you know that he continues to do a great job, and we continue to enjoy tapping into those natural predator-prey relationships that exist. So we made our first vintage of Cab Franc in 1999, and we love Cabernet Franc here. It's certainly a signature wine for us, and it's one of the wines that we are best known for. I think over the years, we've developed a really excellent understanding of what it takes to grow exceptional Cab Franc in the vineyard, and also to craft it into a fine wine. Our nearest neighbor to the south of the vineyard is a limestone quarry, and earlier in the presentation, you showed a picture of Balls Falls, and that is literally right across the road from us. So we have a site that is ideally suited to Cabernet Franc. With the combined age of the vines and the deep root system that they've developed, really is an excellent site for it. Our Cab Franc has been a vintage as essential for many years, and it really is a top seller in its category, in part because it consistently over-delivers on the quality price ratio. This really is a $25 wine that retails for $19.95. You've got
Louise, you mentioned, well, it says VQA Niagara Peninsula, but I know this is mostly estate fruit, is it not?
It is mostly estate fruit, and we label all of our wines with Niagara Peninsula, mostly because I feel that is a really easily identifiable moniker for folks in vintages. And I wholeheartedly support the sub-appellation system, but I really feel that when people see something that says Niagara, then there's an immediate association with the peninsula. So yes, this is largely estate fruit, about 80%, and a little bit of fruit from another bench vineyard. But we label pretty much all of our wines with Niagara Peninsula in terms of appellation. So this wine in the glass, I don't know if you've got some there with you, but it's... I
noticed there's also... I've got some in my glass here. You've also got a splash of Merlot here. I see 14%. What are you looking for the Merlot to add to the Cabernet Franc?
Yeah, Merlot just adds a little bit of finesse with this. It adds a little bit more of that berry character. I think on the nose, this has some big, juicy red berry and a little bit of herbs, some black pepper, and some nice integrated spice. There's American oak with this. So you get some of that, a little bit of brambleberry, but I think the Merlot just adds a little hint of softness and also really heightens the fruit character.
And you say American wood, but I'm not picking up a strong wood profile here. I'm assuming these are mostly used barrels, or a very small percentage of new?
25% new in any given year with this. And so a decent amount, but we barrel ferment. And so I think you get a really nice integration of the oak barrel when it's actually fermented in the barrel versus fermented in stainless and then aged in oak. It's a little bit more work to actually do the ferments in barrel, but I think you get a much more finessed integration of the oak character.
Yeah, I can't imagine the amount of work when you've got a number of individual barrels that you've got to siphon off and clean out the pomace and all the rest of it.
Brutal.
That's a point of difference. So there you have it.
We're slow learners at Featherstone, and if there's a harder way of doing something, we can usually, go right to it and figure that out pretty quick.
Well, just think of all the time and money you save with the hawk flying around the vineyard, getting rid of those devastating birds.
We get flocks of starlings down here that are, 5, 7, 10,000 birds in a flock. And starlings are those little black birds you see bouncing around on your front yard. They're kind of iridescent and they're a bit smaller than a robin. And they're not even a native species. I mean, we have starlings in North America because of Shakespeare. In 1895, the Shakespearean Society in New York City decided that they wanted to have all the birds of Shakespeare's sonnets in Central Park. So they brought over starlings, English house sparrows, and blackbirds, which all have been wildly successful and compete with our local songbirds for food and habitat and cause all kinds of economic nuisance, not only to grape farmers, but also all kinds of tender fruit, blueberries, raspberries. They even get into dairy barns and cause problems.
Well, so there you go. A little known fact, but yes, European imports, those starlings that have caused all sorts of problems. Well, at least they gave us good grapevines, those
and you end up with these lovely, ripe, juicy flavors and food pairings that you alluded to earlier. Comfort food off the grill is lovely. Gourmet sausages, roasted vegetables.
And I noticed you do wood-burning pizzas at the estate as well. I could see this with a beautiful thin crust, a little zesty tomato sauce. That would be pretty much a match made in heaven. Louise, thank you so much for sharing your wine, and love to come and say hello to your beautiful hawk again. That's quite a magnificent bird.
We'd love to have you.
Thank you so much. All right, let's go a little bit down the escarpment. Let's bring in Gabe DeMarco from Cave Spring Vineyard. Gabe, are you with us?
I believe so. Hello.
I know you there, Gabe. There you are. Brilliant. All right. So, we're familiar with the estate. We've seen you here before. Welcome back. But now let's dig into the Cabernet Franc. We know you're a Riesling specialist, but you also make quite a few different Cabernet Francs. Tell us about this particular bottle that we'll be tasting. And tell me if I told a lie. Are you comfortable with Cabernet Franc as a variety in the vineyard? Does it cause you less gray hair? Well, you're too young to have gray hairs, but
thank you, baby face. You were not incorrect, John. Sorry to interrupt there, but we love Cab Franc here. We actually, Cave Spring has done a lot of experimenting in its 35 years. We've actually owned the vineyards longer than that, and kind of we like to joke around the winery that the kind of experimenting is over. We really, minus a very small planting of Gewürztraminer, which we're proud to make. We grow exclusively what are known as the core varieties. So what the varieties we're doing these 5 videos on, plus a holding of Pinot Gris. And so we love Cab Franc so much that we pulled out all of our other Bordeaux varieties and grow exclusively Cabernet Franc. And so really focusing on a single variety Cab Francs. Sustainably grown, of course, and made in the winery, and just really trying to wave the flag for Cab Franc. Just get people to know and understand Cab Franc as a single variety. It's not something that's done, around the world very often, and we have a great site for it. We kind of, I think you're drinking the 17. I have the 18 here today. Both very different vintages in terms of heat accumulation, but we effortlessly ripened in both years. Natural alcohol of 13.5%, 14%. That's just to speak to the kind of the nature of the site and how we can ripen Cab Franc. The wine is Niagara Peninsula, but it moves to kind of Niagara Escarpment into 18 and 19 as our established vineyards that we replanted, and in the teens, the 2014, 15 kind of really come into production. And it kind of, this wine is really trying to get a high quality Cabernet Franc to the consumers of Ontario at a good price. And so how we kind of do that is we use our grower, our vineyard manager has a small holding of Cabernet Franc by the lake. And you know, like you were mentioning earlier, the lighter soil, his sites have lighter soil, so we get the softer tan in them, our fruity, plush Cabernet Franc by the lake. And then we marry that with, you know, over 80% of our estate fruit, and you get the structure and that, like, that finesse, that kind of electric acidity, as you like to say. And then you bring in that plush, soft Cab Franc from the lake, and you get this like very approachable Cabernet Franc at a young age. In conjunction, of course, with natural ferments, and we do a substantial amount of gravity to barrel, just to kind of get that nice plush approachability, that fruitiness, trying to marry that.
So this is 100% Cabernet Franc, correct?
Yes, yeah.
So whereas Louise, with her exclusive escarpment Cabernet Franc, threw in a little bit of Merlot to soften it out, here you've got the same effect, but also from Cabernet Franc, just further on down by the lake, which is a little bit softer, yes? Yeah,
just trying to get to know the variety in Ontario, and then present it as a single variety to the consumer. It's kind of an uphill battle, I think, in a lot of ways. People are very comfortable to see Cab Franc blended with other varieties, but we're trying to, like, see if we...
How's that battle going in terms of consumer perception? Because, you know, Cabernet Franc, for whatever reason, somehow seems a little less sexy than Cabernet Sauvignon. I think it's a beautiful variety myself. I know that it's being planted in so many other parts of the world to bring in finesse and perfume. Here we do it effortlessly, as you say.
Yeah.
How has the consumer perception changed in the period of time that you've been making it and talking to customers about it?
You know, it's exceptionally strong in the restaurants across the province. Some sommeliers like really are looking for it. LCBO has been it's a slower growth in the LCBO, but I think we're doing respectably well. You know, so, you know, thank you to the staff for you know, promoting it and being fans of ours for that. But yeah, it's been a slower growth in the LCBO, but very strong, very strong in restaurants and events and things like that.
Well, we know how demand works, right? Once it starts to get out there, certainly in the restaurant market and the trade market, then the pull eventually comes through the retail channels as well. So I would suspect that we'll continue to see growth in the Cabernet Franc category, certainly in the Ontario Cabernet Franc category.
Yeah, we hope so, and we were proud of the lineup, you know, from this wine all the way to the estate. And we'd also do a Passamento Cab Franc as well. The name of that wine is La Pena. And yeah, we do it exclusively with Cab Franc for the nature of its thick skins and its resistance to disease. So it does great with the Passamento. And
well, they've been playing around with that in the Veneto for a long time, and there's some very expensive wines made with Cabernet Franc in the Passamento style. So thank you very much, Gabe, for presenting this wine. You might have to increase your production if demand does start to grow. 2,100 cases, that's not a huge production, but it sounds like you've got the vineyards to grow, and you're also making several different levels. So carry on, and my best to you in harvest this year.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
And on the note of Passamento, let's carry on our little tour of the peninsula and head down to the Foreign Affair Winery, a winery that was based on, or started out with, the principle of making wines in the Passamento Venetian style. We have Ed Haddon, estate manager, sommelier, all around factotum of the estate. So, well, since we're talking about the subject of Passamento, tell us what it does for Cabernet Franc in particular. Now, I've got your Conspiracy wine. That's the wine that we're presenting, 2017. But you also kindly sent me along a little sample bottle of the same wine, but without the ripasso method. We're not talking full Passamento. Right. We're talking ripasso. You tell me what your philosophy was behind it, and I'll tell you what I'm tasting in the glass.
Well, for us here at Foreign Affair, since the beginning, the very first wine we ever made at Foreign Affair was the 2004 vintage, and it was 100% Cabernet Franc and 100% of Passamento. Len Crispino, the founder of the winery, visited Veneto, fell in love with those wines, and wanted to bring that technique back to Canada. A couple of other people, La Pena, of course, in there very early as well, making this sort of wine. And it's interesting, we both chose Cab Franc as the king for that kind of a Passamento winemaking. The Conspiracy that you have there is a ripasso, as you mentioned. So we go to a tremendous amount of trouble to make this a Passamento product, drying the grapes, losing all that volume, making that wine. But then instead of simply composting the skins like you normally would after it gets into the press. We save those skins, put them back on top of a straight fresh crush, Cab Franc, Cab Sauv, Merlot, and this year a little bit of Petit Verdot. That doesn't always get in there. And let them sit for another, it depends, 3 weeks to 5 weeks in that neighborhood. It's a bit of a high wire act doing Ripasso. There's a lot of microbiological danger spots there. But if you can keep it clean, and I think you can demonstrate there by tasting those two wines, there's a big difference between the one that had no Ripasso on it and one that actually spent time in Ripasso. I should also point out that's my last two little sample bottles. Every year I bottle up a couple cases of that just to demonstrate to people. And you got the last two one now.
Well, that's very kind of you to have shared these with me. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume that there's still a little bit of sugar left on those skins after the full Appassimento style wine has been made. At least that's the way it works in the Veneto. So when you add those skins back to the base wine, you're going to provoke another kind of secondary fermentation, gain a little bit more alcohol.
Exactly. We get maybe another half point. It's not a lot. We managed to get most of the sugar converted in the first fermentation, but there is a little bit in there. So we get maybe half a point of alcohol, but the critical part for me isn't that. It's the, we get a better color, we fix better color, and we also get a much punchier aroma, more of that dried fruit. You get more of that fig, date kind of note coming through in the wine.
Well, I have to say, I like both of these wines quite a lot. The non-Ripasso version, you know, that more familiar NIAGARA Cabernet Franc profile for me, the juiciness, the freshness, the liveliness. I'm assuming you're harvesting maybe a touch earlier here to have perfectly clean fruit if you're going to put it through this process too.
Oh yeah, so it has to be hand harvested entirely when we're doing the Appassimento stuff. There's no way you can do machine harvesting. And it winds up being about 3 passes through the vineyard to get it all what we want. So the labor is insane, but we do it not because it's expensive, but because that's the flavor we're looking for.
Well, as we're learning, most of the winemakers in Ontario seem to be fond of work, shall we say, you know, doing that extra little bit of work to make all the difference.
Yeah, for me, ways to make money.
Well, the conspiracy, aside from the non-Cabernet Franc portions of it here, because I guess this Unripasso, that's the same blend, is it not?
Yep.
So exact same wine?
Yeah, same blend. Yeah.
But you certainly do get a little bit more breadth, a little bit more glycerol, a slightly rounder, more ample texture, and also a little bit more concentration of tannin.
Yeah.
Tannins in this case very soft, but yeah, a little bit more of a structured wine, something that you could probably comfortably tuck in the cellar for another couple of years and expect it to improve, not just get old, right?
Yes, exactly.
And what do Len and Marissa eat alongside their conspiracy when they're drinking this wine?
Well, this thing for me loves a lot of tomato-based dishes. I think it works well. The price point is nice enough for Tuesday night and pizza. I think that works well, but it can also stand up to beef, and I'm still doing a lot of barbecue at home, so I think it works well with even a steak. But I love it with pasta dishes personally.
We're getting into ragu season, so why not a little bolognese, some slow stewed beef, something like that, sitting by the fire, a nice, comforting, warming wine.
Indeed.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Ed, for sharing your story and the nature and the effects of Ripasso and Appassimento, part of the Ontario wine story. Enjoy the rest of harvest.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. All right, let us carry on. Let's go down to the other side of the peninsula. Let's bring in Craig McDonald, one of our experienced senior statesmen who's looking very stately with that wonderful beard you've grown in the last few months. Welcome, Craig.
I used to be one of the young guys at one point, John, but thanks for pointing that out. Yeah,
well,
22.
You held on to your accent beautifully. I mean, we consider you one of our own, but we know one point you came from somewhere else, but we're going to call you from Ontario. Tell us about TRIUS, and tell us about your TRIUS Red in particular.
Yeah, thanks, John. I often use the tagline when I first came to Canada. The very first wine I drank was a TRIUS Red 1995, and it was the first wine that Jay I had, and I was really captivated by that. And actually, the other wine that I had was from Angelo at Cave, now Gabe, obviously in the chair, but Riesling. So So yeah, Cab Franc has definitely been the driving force for my journey as a winemaker here in Ontario, but certainly TRIUS and certainly TRIUS Red. You know, it's been making this wine at formerly Hillebrand back in '83. Peter Milzinski and some investors from Europe bought Newark wines off the late Joe Pahorley. Cheers, Joe. And then in 2012, we renamed it TRIUS. So it's the same winery, it's the same as Hillebrand, but many years later now called TRIUS, but still made in this sort of iconic bottle, still made the same way, still a Bordeaux blend, and obviously Cab Franc is very important for that.
So tell us
I can keep rambling forever.
Oh, you've got some brilliant insight here, and I want to mine it as much as I can here. So you've got about a third Cabernet Franc, and then Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon. Tell us what you get, because I presume you make this blend afterwards. You're not co-fermenting these wines. What do you get from each of these components, and how do they fit together?
Yeah, it's all from 4 Mile Creek, predominantly 4 Mile Creek. So we're one of the warmer sub-apps in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and we go down towards the lakeshore where it gets a little cooler. So, but the funny thing was, I'm hearing a lot of comments, and I agree that, you know, Merlot plays a supporting role and is often a bit of a juicier underpinning to a blend. I often find in Niagara-on-the-Lake that Merlot can actually be quite intense and quite tannic. A lot of dehydration and high alcohols with Merlot. Obviously, Cab Sauv can be very tannic, very small berried variety with intense structure and a very chiseled feel. And I actually find that Cab Franc is the velvet in between. It actually plays a great supporting role on a textural level, as well as it does the reasons you mentioned, John, that wonderful herbaceous characters, red fruit, you know, very bright and lively that it brings to a blend. But I think texturally it adds a really a harmonious kind of dimension to Cab Sauv and Merlot, in my experience. So it really has a major part of that.
I'm looking at the alcohol level here listed as 12.8%. I'm assuming that's correct. Yet in this case, I don't get a lot of the herbal vegetal character. It seems to be quite well ripened out. How do you manage that degree of ripeness at such moderate alcohol levels?
Really good question. I think viticulture is probably the main culprit there. You know, if you came to Niagara 20 years ago, you'd see vineyards in much different condition than you do today. You should drive along the QEW. You know, they're perfectly manicured and hedged, fully exposed to the sun. Yields are much lower than they used to be. So we're managing to not remove green character, I wouldn't say that, but take away some of the diluted green flavours and get more intensity to the wine. That's really what it's about. It's not about you know, alcohol necessarily. It's about maximising the intensity and the variety of the particular vintage. And this one was 18, which, you know, was a cooler year. It's a bit like 17. They're both reasonably cool summers, but we did have a real heat spike in the fall of both 17 and 18. 18 was a bit more dramatic. So that kind of helped us, John, to soften and give more of a subtle feel to the wine, as opposed to, you know, 2016 or hopefully 2020, which we're going to see much more intense, bold, richer wines.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, what's your feeling on ageability for this wine? I've had some pretty old TRIUS blends, and they age pretty magnificently. Do you expect this, or when would you recommend drinking this ideally, other than this afternoon?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can drink them upon release and decant them. I always say decant any red wine. I think it just benefits from a bit of air. But the cooler years, in my experience, have often aged the best, John. You know, I remember when I first came to TRIUS, I invited JL for lunch, and we opened a 97, which, you know, wasn't as good as 95. It was certainly better than 96, but not as good as 98 that was out. And it was fantastic. It was still drinking really well, a 97 from Niagara. So, you know, it's those cooler ones, lower alcohols, much more balance. And, you know, it's easy to put together a wine in a very ripe year, but it takes a much more deft hand in a cooler vintage to get it right. And fortunately, we have a lot of cooler vintages here, so our winemakers are well versed in that. But yeah, this wine, I've had it for, you know, at least 10 to 15 years and still going. getting into the secondary and tertiary notes, of course, but that's part of the journey of wine, right? It doesn't have fruit bomb, especially when it's Cab Franc. You've got those beautiful layered components of the herbaceous characters, which just integrate so well over time.
And lastly, Craig, what do you say to the naysayers, and they're still out there, who believe that Ontario can't make serious age-worthy reds?
Yeah, well, you know, you got to come down to wine country and try it again. We have evolved for sure. I think we had humble beginnings way back in the day. And actually, Angelo, a great mentor of mine, always told me about those 5 varieties were the key to success. So come down, and I think, you know, VQA have done a great job of advertising what we do best, and those 5 are what we do best on a world-class stage, and Cab Franc is right at the front of it. So you've just got to come down. 17 vintages are out now. They're exceptional wines. I mean, 2017 was one of the best vintages, I think, of Cab Franc that we'll find, and they're everywhere. So you've just got to come down and try. Let's get it in you.
There you go. Fair enough. Well, I'm coming down, I promise.
We'd love to have you, John.
Long overdue for a visit. And thanks for such great reds, and also, I have to say, sparkling wines and so much else in the TRIUS portfolio. The whole Peller portfolio, pretty magnificent. Thank you. We're glad you came to Ontario and stayed here for 22 years.
Love it. Cheers, mate.
Need you for another 22. All right, have a great harvest.
Thanks, John.
Okay, all right. Let's bring in the venerable Bruce Nicholson from the venerable Inniskillin. Bruce, do we have you there? There he is.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Morning.
Sorry to disturb you in the middle of harvest here. We're just going to have a quick little chat about Inniskillin. I'm sure most of the viewers are obviously familiar with the brand and a little bit about the history. So maybe just remind us about the legacy of Inniskillin, and then lead us into the reserve Cabernet Franc that we have.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and I appreciate you being moderator here. I mean, you've been a great resource and friend of the Canadian wine industry for many years. I've been on your panel before. As you probably know, this is my 35th vintage in the Canadian wine industry. And I spent 20 of those years in the Okanagan before coming to the iconic Inniskillin here, which is a winery that I had, when I finished university, that I was trying to get into. And I had asked Carl Kaiser to come and work for him for free, because he was the person with I felt with the most knowledge. But going back to my time in the Okanagan, I don't believe, you know, at the time when all these vineyards were being planted in the late 1900s and 2000, is that Cabernet Franc was appreciated like it should have been. Most of the plantings were of, the Bordeaux varieties were of Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon. And I always thought there should have been more, and maybe, and I believe there are more now, but there's, I remember a 2005 Cabernet Franc I had that I thought was one of the best red wines I'd ever tried in that area. So when I came to Niagara in the beginning part of 2007, it was nice to see that there's so much Cab Franc, that there was that confidence in the in this variety, and there were so many growers that had their faith in Cab Franc, and rightly so. And as you know, there's so many, and you touched on it. So there's so many different styles of Cab Franc, and at Inniskillin, we take full advantage of the versatile grape that it is. You know, starting with I have some entry-level SKUs of Cabernet Franc, some blends, Cab Merlot, Cab blends, Meritage. Even last few years, I've done a Cab Franc Rosé, very popular, and of course, and what would be Inniskillin if I didn't go venture into an ice wine with a Cab Franc, doing a Cab Franc ice wine as well as a sparkling Cab Franc. This particular 2017 reserve comes from a very good year. In 2017, I think Craig touched on it there, that we have had a very warm, very good September and October, and I think, and you'll notice this was a very full-bodied wine here, and you take a look at that alcohol here, that at just over 14, and it's a wine that I aged in both French and American oak for 14 months. I think it is a great example of what can be achieved in Niagara. This is from Beamsville Bench. This is 100% Cabernet Franc. If in a different year, I might have added a little bit of Merlot, but in this case here, I thought the blend being at 100% worked out very well.
Yeah, perhaps you could tell us just a little bit about the difference in Cabernet Franc from the bench, where this is from, and over down by the winery. I know you've got some down there. What are some of the characteristical differences that you observe?
John, as an estate, we don't have Cab Franc on the estate.
There's none down there. Okay, my mistake.
There isn't actually. I do get some Cab Franc. I get my Cab Franc from right across the street from Albert Seeger. But yeah, that's interesting. The Montague, which, as you know, very well-known, popular vineyard in 4 Mile Creek, does not have Cab Franc. So I get it from the Beamsville Bench, and as I've mentioned here, this was a wine that was able to hang and become very was ripe at those herbaceous characters that you might find in one of our other SKUs here. That really is not as existent here. So that's
it's a pretty ripe and bold and full-bodied wine, 14.2% alcohol, as you say. So you went out and sought this particular parcel.
Yes.
In the bench area. What were you looking for there? What were you hoping to be able to produce from fruit from that area as opposed to down in the Niagara on the Lake area?
Well, you know what, this is, like I said, it's come from Beamsville Bench. 20-year-old vine, planted in 1999. There's about just over 7 acres of this, and with this particular clone that does very, very well here. I was looking for something that has the ability to hang, and as you know, and as we mentioned here, these Cab Franc has the ability to hang a little bit longer. It ripens a little bit later than the Merlot, and a little bit sooner than Cab Franc. And I'm actually, what I'm looking for is to get that full bodied and maybe just minimize those herbaceous characteristics, because I think we've got enough SKUs. I find more of the entry level have got that really bell pepper and green and pepper. So if I can, in this particular SKU, if I can minimize that, I will do that. And this wine, 17 has also those characteristics of kind of not herbaceous, but those leather and tobacco, along with some that blue fruit and spice.
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit more of if there is a vegetal component, it's more of a roasted vegetal component, which I quite like. You take those peppers, you throw them on the grill, and you get that wonderful roasted plus herbal side. Let me ask you one more thing, Bruce, just about cost and price. We had a session on Pinot Noir. We all love Pinot Noir. We know it's a little bit of a challenging variety to grow, and yields tend to be pretty low, at least if you're trying to make quality wine. Does Cabernet Franc allow you to yield a little bit more generously, yet still make rich, intense, full-bodied wines? I mean, I'm looking at all the prices here. They're all kind of 25 and under, some under $20. How is that possible?
Well, this is it for a few reasons, John. I mean, everybody knows where we are with Pinot Noir. And we've all said it, numerous times, that the Pinot Noir needs to be, particularly has to be cropped very low to get the quality on a high end. And Pinot here, I really give credit to our viticulture team. This particular vineyard is managed by Gerald Close, who's been in the Canadian wine industry for over 40 years, and he is, and with a good year, we have a good year. This will be, I think, very similar this year as well. I'm looking for a big, bold Bordeaux style wines for 2020. So we can look forward to that. But, it's the vintage, and the viticulture team. They understand where they need to be and what I'm looking for. If I'm going to be putting out a $25 bottle of Cab and call it a reserve, then I believe they know what, and I have the confidence in them to crop it accordingly and manage the farm.
Are you getting a few extra kilos per acre with Cab Franc?
As opposed to a Pinot Noir, we would.
Yeah,
and we can do that, you know. Where Pinot on a higher end Pinot would, you know, we stick maybe 2.5 to 3, and again depending on the harvest. But then Cab Franc we can go a little higher than that. Of course, we just want to keep those the word that we heard earlier, that humidity, regardless of what variety, particularly in Pinot Noirs, we know we want to leave that word humidity out of the equation.
Brilliant. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask one last question about Cabernet Franc ice wine, since you are the maestro, the specialist in the field. How does Cabernet Franc perform as an ice wine variety relative to, say, Vidal and Riesling?
You know, it probably is one of my favorites, John, and it's the reason that I believe when I in 2012 I liked it so much. I loved the fruit, you know, that strawberries and cream, the red berry characteristics, and but mainly some good acidity. It actually was one of my favorites. This is why I ended up saying, you know, let's go into a sparkling with this particular wine here. It's a little bit, you know, it's a little more vulnerable on the vines. It's a red grape that sits on the vines, and we talk about, where there's mentioned earlier about the starlings. Well, they love to go after those red grapes.
I'm sure they do.
That we leave on the vine. So it's a first pick when it's cold, Cab Franc. But in the end, it's certainly one of my favorites in both the sparkling and still ice wine, for sure.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for your time. I know you've got a winery to run and lots of wines to make. Hopefully some big, bold, beautiful Cabernet Franc in 2020. Look forward to coming and seeing you down at the winery sometime soon.
That'd be great. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you. All the best. All right, let's head down from the bench down into Lincoln Lakeshore. Well, we're going to kind of stay in the same area. We've got Paul Pender from TAWSE Winery here. Paul, do join us, please. I know you're busy in harvest as well. There he is. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I am terrific. Thank you so much. So listen, you know, TAWSE is an important name in the Ontario wine scene. Remind us a little bit about the history, Maury, how we got started. You've been there since, wow, I think almost the beginning, right? You took over in 2006 officially, so lots of experience, and you grow Riesling and Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So I'd love to hear your take on where Cabernet Franc fits into the big five, we'll call them, varieties in Ontario.
TAWSE Winery was started back in 2001 by Maury TAWSE, really with a focus on making terroir-driven wines, certified organic. We have 160 acres that we farm or certified organic. Really just trying to find the individual expression of all of our vineyards in all the wines that we make. And the Cabernet Franc being no exception to that. Not often maybe discussed as a terroir wine, but we do believe that it really does express its terroir site to site.
So this one is down on, I'm going to pull up the slide here. So we know where the winery is there. But this particular vineyard, Lonnie Vineyard, is in Lincoln Lakeshore. Tell us a little bit about growing Cabernet Franc in that sub-appellation. You've been making this wine. I've been following it for many years. It's regularly among the top examples in the province. What makes it so special?
We've been making this wine since 2002. It was the first, one of the first wines I did when I came into TAWSE before I started to work here, and it really blew me away. The 02 vintage was just a phenomenal wine. We have 2 bottles left in our cellar, and last year we opened one. It was still showing beautifully. What makes this site so special is it's a really interesting site right on the shores of Lake Ontario in Beamsville. The northernmost part of this vineyard, the roots would be in basically right on the shores of Lake Ontario. So because of its proximity to the lake, we really do get a long frost-free growing season. down by the lake, it's often 4 or 5 degrees cooler than it is away from the lake.
Mm-hmm.
Cabernet Franc really likes that long, not overly hot season. So we get great ripeness on this vineyard year in and year out.
Well, I have to confess, I had a 2007 of this wine recently, and I didn't call you up. I did think of you, but it was also drinking really quite spectacularly. You know, here we're at a level of intensity and density of fruit character and concentration that allows, I think, great longevity. Yet at the same time, tasting this 2016 now, it's also coming into its own. So it seems that it has a really long drinking window. Has that been your experience?
It really is a wine that ages incredibly well. They said our history goes back to 2002, and to this date, it's still drinking well, and not quite sure how long they will age, but they do evolve really nicely and develop a lot of great flavors as they age.
Tell me a little bit about the soils down in this particular patch of Lincoln Lake Shores. Are these lighter alluvial or lake bed sedimentary soils, or more clay?
They are fairly sandy soils down there. That being said, as you go a little bit deeper down, there is some heavier clays. And as these vines get older, they're starting to access some of the heavier soils. This planting goes back to the mid-'80s, so some of the oldest Cabernet Franc planted in Niagara. And it has survived very well, just I think due to the influence of the lake. It doesn't get that cold in the winter. And
is it a winter hardier variety than, say, Merlot?
We find it to be very winter hardy. Even in the toughest spots, it seems to do fairly well. We've found little to no damage down to temperatures of -23, -24, which makes it a really great, consistent producer in Ontario.
Yeah, it's certainly an advantage in our climate.
Absolutely.
So you make some pretty brilliant Pinot Noirs as well. I mean, the full range is great. How do you treat Cabernet Franc? Do you take a more Pinot approach? We call it a more Burgundian approach, or more Bordelais approach, or Loire Valley approach?
We would treat it a bit more like Pinot. You can see we do put it in a Pinot bottle. Our winemaking is fairly simple. We handpick, destem, but we don't crush. So we're going into the fermenter whole berry, and just allow for a soft, gentle extraction, a couple of pump overs every day. Really looking for nuance and elegance as opposed to big and extracted. And then after fermentation, aged in French oak barrels, maximum of about 25% new wood, but sometimes less depending on the year, and aged in barrel for about 16 months.
I really do appreciate the texture, wonderful silky texture with a real sweet fruit core. I mean, I know there's no sugar in here, but it gives that gentle impression of really ripe fruit. You get a sense that this hung out a long time in the vineyard, reached a really high degree of ripeness without the alcohol shooting too far. 14%, it wears it really quite comfortably.
Yeah, the one thing we've done from the beginning at TAWSE with Cab Franc is really allow them to hang on the vines. We typically don't pick any Cab Franc until the first week in November. And my feeling is I think there are some kind of enzymatic changes that start to happen where the vine, we do lose a little bit of that greeniness, as you said earlier. It is the grape, and we don't want to lose it entirely, but I do think we can mitigate it a bit and have it take a backseat to some of the other flavors. And what we find is typically after October, the sugars don't really go up anymore. We're not really gaining any more alcohol, but we are seeing some changes in the tannins and in the flavor profile.
Yeah, for sure. I guess you're getting a little polymerization of tannins right there in the bunches on the vines before they even get into the winery. So you're already a step ahead of the game if you're looking for finesse and elegance in the wine. Brilliant. Well, thank you, Paul Pender.
My pleasure. Thank you
Keep
so much
up the terrific work, and good luck with harvest.
Thank you.
Thank you. And well, that brings us to the end of our little mini tasting of Cabernet Franc. Let's bring back Magdalena Kaiser with a couple of closing words. Magda.
Hello, and thank you. Do you mind going to the next slide? That would be great. Thanks so much. So yes, thank you very much, everyone today. It's been another amazing session. And again, everyone's busy with harvest. It's going to be another great year in Ontario, so that's exciting. And thank you to John for leading us through the session again. And thanks again to the LCBO staff, for all of you for tuning in again today. We hope that this has contributed to what we know is your commitment to education, service, and knowledge, which is so important for people in Ontario. You know, for me, Cabernet Franc is certainly one of my favorite varieties, so it's just really exciting and fun to hear all of the great things today that were said by the producers and these amazing wines. When people visit from around the world, they are truly excited about Cabernet Franc from Ontario. And so that's something we all can really be proud of. And there's so many different styles to choose from within the variety. So the one underpinning message that we always want to remember, and I'm always sounding a little bit repetitive, but that VQA is certified 100% Ontario grown. So we want to just make sure that we know that people need to look for VQA on the bottle to know that it is local. And more than ever right now, people are really looking for local because they want to support our local economy, and they want to pick the most sustainable choice for them. And that means Ontario VQA wine. It really does contribute so much to our local economy. The numbers speak for themselves: 18,000 jobs across all sectors, and also $98.20 is contributed back into, or injected back into, the Ontario economy for every single bottle of VQA wine that someone purchases. So those numbers are just really compelling. And the last comment, of course, is always about the value proposition. And Ontario really does provide amazing value. I think from what we've heard today, the price points of these wines, the quality, the concentration, the elegance, these wines are great value and a great opportunity for people to discover what is grown in their own Ontario wine region, in their own backyard. So thank you for joining us for these sessions. And just as a reminder to anyone at the LCBO who wants to get more information on the wines specifically, or from the wineries that we spoke to today, please contact Doug Beattie. He's the Ontario VQA Wine Ambassador, and he's always happy to help. He's been in the industry for a long time. So thank you again for tuning in. We hope you have an amazing fall, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Cheers.